it would be nice to have the Sixers, but Ben Simmons wouldn't be playing right now, and we would all probably be pulling our hair out.
But we have plenty to talk about when it comes to that, because we have the author of Tanking to the Top, Bleacher Report, NBA writer Yaron Weitzman. Thank you so much for taking a little bit of time to join us. Congratulations on the book coming out this week.
A feel-good story.
A feel-good story.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. It was always my dream to put out a book during a pandemic, so I'm glad I got to accomplish that.
About Sam Hinkie and the process. I'm sure that was always what you dreamed about.
Exactly.
It's interesting. I wasn't sure what to expect when Jeff originally showed me the book idea. I wasn't sure whether it was going to be a technical book or a management book. It seems like it's more about the business of basketball and the personalities and politics than it is necessarily the other things. How did you decide you wanted to write about this? And is it what you thought when you originally had the idea for the book? Did it come out that way you intended?
Absolutely not, which I'm actually happy about, right? I guess that's a good thing, right? Because it means you learn something new along the way. But no, so the way I got to this book is I cover the NBA for Bleacher Report in New York. I'm a quote-unquote national writer, which means I have to write stories that a national audience would find interesting. To do that, I had to leave New York because the Knicks weren't cutting it. So I would start going to Philadelphia semi-regularly around 2017, 2018. I was around them during the playoffs, and I thought it would be a good book idea. But it's funny, so like you mentioned, is it what I thought for the way it works? And I'm not going to go too deep into this, but you come up with an idea, you write a proposal, the proposal gets pitched to publishers, that gets a book deal. If you look at my proposal and what I ended up writing, completely different. Like not even close. Like I kind of thought I was going to be more Moneyball-esque around Sam Hinkie and that kind of thing, and it ended up being more, like you said, the backroom politics. And the way I like to kind of think about it is like, I hope, and I found this illuminating for myself, right, that I think it's a book about like how the NBA works, right, just how everything that goes on behind the scenes that leads to the product we see on the court.
Now, what did you say this is the way the NBA works? For the other teams in the NBA, they're hoping this is not how it works for them. What was it about what the Sixers did that was so unique and, if anything, caught the NBA, other front offices off guard?
It's funny, right? No, it is funny, right? So this is, but the Sixers turned this up to an extreme, and I'm going to say it's hard to explain. Something about the whole process just drove everyone associated just like mad, right? It just created like such strong divergent opinions and factions, and it's like almost like political, right? The idea that just two rival different factions and just can't agree on anything. It's really interesting. It's like the Sixers, I guess it's the idea that they went deeper, because rebuilding, or I'll even say, right, tanking is not new. Like Sam Hinkie wasn't the first person to say, hey, drafting, getting a top pick is a good idea. We'll do that for a year. He just took it a little further than everyone else. And he is also a bit of a polarizing figure, unique, but it's like, he could be both kind and open-minded, and he's obviously brilliant, but he could also be a little cold and have some tunnel vision and rigid in his ways, which is fascinating. And so, you have all these different opinions about him. And I think you combine all of that, and it just creates this whole storm.
You describe a lot of examples with Sam Hinkie about him alienating agents, didn't release veterans because he wanted picks. Opposing GMs thought he was always trying to take the most of everything. Do you think he realized that he was burning bridges? Because it seemed like he was well aware that tanking would be controversial. You have an anecdote about him talking to Jason Richardson, which I found hilarious in the book. So I was just wondering your take on him, and if you could tell the story about what Sam Hinkie did to try and find dinner.
I'll answer. So I'll give you an anecdote then, because your question's a great one, right? So after the Drew Holiday trade, right, which in 2013 draft, that sort of set off, it became very obvious what direction the Sixers were going in, and Jason Richardson was one of the lone remaining veterans on the team. So not angrily, but just, him and his manager scheduled a meeting with Hinkie to sort of come in and talk to him and see what was in store and what, he had in plan and all that stuff. And the meeting goes about 30 minutes, 45 minutes, and they're heading out, and Hinkie goes, do you have any good restaurant recommendations? and you give him one, and he says something along the lines of, I hope they have a back door because I'm going to have to sneak out because everybody in the city is going to hate me. Which is hilarious. So he was keenly aware. His idea was, so in terms of the fans, he kind of felt like, I'm going to save them from themselves. Like, I know what they want. They know what they want. They're just not aware of the best way to get it, right? A championship. They don't understand the best way to get it. I'm going to get it. I'm going to kind of, again, save them from themselves. I'll get it, and then it'll be all okay, right? I think he kind of assumed, and probably naively, right, like that the work would speak for itself, that would be all that would matter. So again, that means in terms of his dealings with the fans, in terms of his dealings like with agents, like, well, someone explained it to me that, the bet he was making was that, okay, so maybe Agent X isn't happy about the way Sam Hinkie, squeezed him on a contract extension for, random eighth man. And the agent could decide, and certain agents did make decrees, like, we will not deal with Sam Hinkie ever again. But the Sam Hinkie's bet was that, okay, but say they have Superstar X and they're really good in 3 years. Is Superstar X not going to come to us because the agent's annoyed about something that happened 4 years ago? I don't think so, right? He figured it would just all work itself out and pay off. People would move on. And I mean, clearly he was wrong about that.
Oh, he was definitely wrong about that. The relationship with Scott O'Neill I found really interesting. You title that chapter "The Coup," and you talked about them having a tenuous relationship from the start, and you give the anecdote about Scott O'Neill launching the marketing campaign in 2015 as sort of a brush fire moment. Can you talk about the Hinkie relationship and where things went south from the standpoint that this team seemed to be behind the idea at the start and then did not like the feedback negatively that they were getting about it as it went forward?
For sure. I always think, right, some people who don't follow this as closely, like Hinkie gets labeled as the architect for the idea, and that's right, but I think people underestimate how much ownership not only bought in, but how much they wanted it, right? Like the example I gave is, so I think he's the architect. If I'm renovating a house, if I hire an architect, like he's carrying out my vision in a way, right? Like it's not like we're working separate. So for sure. So Hinkie came in. This was radical, but it was a collaborative thing. Everyone was on board. Everyone was aware of what direction that he was going to take things and the team was going to go. But then a couple of things happened. One, so ownership standpoint, it's easy to say you're into something, and then when you hear the criticism from opposing owners, like Mark Lazary, the owner of the Bucks, told me, it's simple. Fans don't like coming out to see bad teams, right? So you have your billionaire buddies who own teams aren't happy. The league office isn't happy for the obvious reasons. And the funny quote Josh Harris said last year at Sloan.
You're a little muffled, by the way. If you could just, I want to make sure everybody hears the story because I think it's an awesome story.
Oh, I apologize. Sorry about that.
No problem. Just want to let you know.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yep.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. What's it called? So Josh Harris said at Sloan last year, we own a $2 billion chemical company. Nobody cares about it. But everyone has an opinion about the Sixers starting lineup. So, you start realizing that, like, the owners, I don't think they realized how much, why should phrase like this? Like, people care, right? They care what people think. So you have that going on. And Scott O'Neill, who's the CEO of the Sixers, it becomes difficult to sell or market a team that's losing, no matter how hard you try. And
So
Scott O'Neill also was somebody who who always wanted to have a say in basketball decisions. So he puts in this marketing campaign in 2015, and Michael Carter-Williams is one of the guys in there. And it's right before the trade deadline, and then the campaign comes out, and Michael Carter-Williams gets traded 2 days later, and O'Neill was pretty upset. There's a few other examples in there about, O'Neill pitching StubHub to sponsor the Sixers on their jerseys and pitching them on a timeline that, by 2017 will be good, when Sam Hinkie would never agree to timelines. And, O'Neill wasn't. Like, I asked the StubHub CEO, what did O'Neill say about Sam Hinkie? The StubHub CEO says, I never heard that name before. I don't know who that is. So it's just kind of telling examples.
You did have Scott didn't seem to want to talk to you. A lot of the Sixers didn't, which sort of surprised me. They didn't want to shape the story more, but didn't surprise me that they didn't want the story out. But you did have a line, Sam did it to himself. Someone had to take the hit. Where did that come from?
So you're right. He didn't talk to me, but I introduced myself. I was in Detroit. I was around the team last year, and we were in Detroit, and I introduced myself and told him what I was doing, and I'm pretty sure he knew. I'm not by my face, but he was aware that the book was written. And I told him, Scott O'Neil, if you go on like Sixers Twitter, right, Sam Hinkie fan, process fan, Sixers Twitter, Scott O'Neil is kind of like, people had a feeling or know that he was not a Hinkie fan. And so I told him, I said, it's kind of funny, you're sort of the boogeyman process fan. And he goes, well, Sam did it to himself. Someone had to take the hit. And I, journalistically, you clearly identify yourself as a journalist. Obvious what I was doing, and we never really spoke again. He kind of turned me down a bunch of times. But yeah, I immediately, as I was walking away, took out my phone, drafted an email, and sent that line to myself. And I knew I was going in.
You talked a little bit about Twitter there. We had another incident with Twitter with the guy who took over. Can you talk a little bit about the Colangelos and how that happened, that they took over, and then what happened with Colangelo and his Twitter account?
Yeah, well, the Twitter account, I'll tell you this, right, with a try explaining to a fact checker that, like, when it's unknown sources is a name, because it's like the typo was his typo and it's not supposed to be unknown, and try explaining to a book fact checker how that needs to stay. Like that, writing that chapter and just putting it all together was one of the strangest, like, I'll call it week or two of my, writing life. It was just, it's like, what am I doing here? What am I looking at? But the Colangelos taking over, yeah, I mean, what's fascinating is that, like, Hinkie was open to the idea. So Jerry comes in, everyone, people know that story. Jerry comes in, he wants to have a co-GM-ship, right? Which I guess that's the phrase, I don't know. Two GMs working together, reporting to Jerry. Hinkie wasn't so enthralled with that, understandably so, but he was open-minded. And they even talked to Danny Ferry, who was somebody who Hinkie had a kind of a strong professional respect for. And Danny Ferry and Brett Brown knew each other from their Spurs days. Brett thought it could help a little bit. He was big on that. He was trying to help Hinkie stay there. Ferry and Hinkie spent a lot of time going over things like org charts and kind of looking at, okay, who's actually going to be in charge, who's not, who makes the call. Understandably so. And while all this is going on, Brian's trying to get the Brooklyn Nets job. He ends up getting passed over for that. Hinkie and Ferry are taking too long, and when that happens, Brian comes in. Brian is hired by the Sixers, and they tell Sam he can stay on to work with the co-GM with Brian, but it's pretty much like, I don't know, if there's three people in the room, two of them are family members, right? Are you really going to have a say? It's not really you decide.
Yeah, you're not exactly sitting at family dinner for that one.
Exactly.
And then so you write about it, about sort of how Burnergate developed and how Brian Colangelo was out in public when the Ringer story came out, how he handled it. I was curious, though, with Colangelo going at the time that he did, you have a lot in the book about Brett Brown, and it sort of comes out that he doesn't really have much disciplinary control over the team, whether you look at Nerlens Noel or, Jahlil Okafor or some of the other anecdotes that you have in there. Do you think that Brett Brown would have still been the coach if Brian Colangelo was still the GM? Because I feel like the vacuum at the top there at that time meant they had to keep Brett because they needed some continuity in basketball operations.
I would agree with that, right? I think Brett, and this is not meant to be a criticism, right? I think he's benefited from the fact, and well, let me rephrase. I was going to say he's benefited from the fact of all the craziness around him. That's not completely fair because he's had to deal with more, we'll call it shenanigans instead of a four-letter word, right? So he's had to deal with more of that than probably any other head coach, right? Just think of the Colangelo and Hinkie stuff and faults and just all of it. So that part is hard. But I do agree with you that, like, when you have all this upheaval, it does help to have some stability and some continuity in there. And I do think he benefited from that. Like if you remember, like Mike D'Antoni came in, some people thought he was being brought in to replace Brett Brown. That was my understanding is that was never made clear to D'Antoni if that was the case, and that was not D'Antoni's goal. But there are people who assume that the Colangelos would try to replace him with one of their guys.
So you mentioned that he's the one piece of stability on the team. I don't know if the stability is so good though. I mean, we have we have a situation here where even recently after your book was written, you have JJ Redick having Jimmy Butler on his podcast saying he didn't know who the bleep was in charge, and you have a chapter in your book about Markelle Fultz that's this is not the bleeping kid we drafted.
Way to censor yourself.
I did
Jeff.
censor myself. So. What is it about, what did you see and what did you hear about Brett Brown that even though he's the leader and that he's the coach, that he's really not the leader and he doesn't seem to be in charge?
Yeah, it's a great question. Part of it, I think, goes back to, and we see it in the league. Like Kenny Atkinson's the example I point to a lot because that just happened, where these guys who come in for the the rebuild stage often don't make it to the next stage, right? And I think part of it. So when Brett came in, I think he made some mistakes. Like in terms of Nerlens Noel was allowed to get away with some stuff. He didn't benefit. Hinkie did not. Hinkie was not a big voice either. Hinkie kind of figured, I'm going to leave the on-court stuff to you. We're going to stay separate. He thought that was important because essentially they had different goals, right?
You had the Okafor gun incident too at that time.
Right, that was later, right, exactly. And some of these, then Hinkie, and so I understand where Hinkie was coming from. It's like, Brett needs to, head coaches have to try to win every game. That's not exactly my goal. There has to be a little line divide between us. That was intentional. So Brett was thrown out, he was kind of left on his own on an island with that stuff. No one ever backs him, and he never, once it starts with Noel, then Joel Embiid comes in, and there's context about why Joel started, having, I'll say acting up. I hate that phrase. I don't know what the better phrase is, but it was with the backdrop of his brother having been killed in a horrific accident, right? And that's Joel's rookie year. And Joel comes back, and I think he later even said he was depressed, right? And he starts acting up, and he's putting on the weight. We all know the Shirley Temple stories and stuff like that. And they're having meetings to say for everyone to tell all the staff to tell Brett that Joel is not listening to any of them. And it's like it's hard. It's a hard thing because how are you supposed to, how do you get a 22-year-old? How do you control that person? First of all, if he's grieving. Second of all, at a certain point, it's like it's on the players too. And like I get asked this a lot. I don't know what the why. I don't know what's missing. It's hard to say, right? It's like an it factor type thing. Part of it is it's one of those things that's hard to explain. Part of it is I go back to like the Tim Duncan, Greg Popovich example, where Popovich always says, Timmy let me coach him. That kind of set everything else up. Joel, if we're going to name, like Joel has not really been that example of a star, right? He's not the same way. And Brett is non-confrontational. And so that stuff goes on, and it goes on, and Simmons comes in, and Brett and Simmons know each other a little bit from back. I mean, there's a family relationship, and Brett's a little bit non-confrontational with him about the shooting. And, these things start snowballing, and all of a sudden just, a lack of accountability inside. So it's like, it's one of those things that's hard to describe or pinpoint exactly what it is, and it's not like I don't believe that Bobby Knight-style disciplinarian is good or useful, or something that should be wanted, but it's just that there's just that feeling, that ability to kind of get guys to buy in and listen that the Sixers and Brett have really never had, I don't think.
You had a quote in the book by Brett Brown, we're all going to get fired because this guy's not in shape.
Yeah.
Can you talk about some of the struggles there? And at the same time, I enjoyed, he almost wasn't a Sixer. You told a story about his workout in Cleveland and the trash talk to Dave Griffin that had me laughing. So can we talk about the arc of Joel Embiid from him then becoming a Sixer when they didn't really expect it at the time, and then going to the arc of now they feel like they're going to lose their job because of him?
Yeah, I mean, welcome to coaching a superstar in the NBA, right? So it's and with Cleveland had the number one pick that year. Embiid, and I hadn't know either. I didn't remember this, or I didn't realize, but like that was the year Wiggins ended up going number one. And Embiid and Wiggins are teammates. But looking back and talking to people, and it was very known in the Kansas basketball community among scouts that like Wiggins is good, Embiid is next level. Like,
and Bill Self, their coach, had told Cleveland that when they were trying to interview him for the job. Correct?
Correct. Yeah, they were spending a lot of time around him. That was right before they hired David Blatt. And he told them, not like he wasn't criticizing Wiggins. It was just the idea that like Embiid's a different level. He was right on, right? So he works up at Cleveland. He has this great workout. He's bullying the assistant coaches in the post. They tell him to go take some threes, and like he hits 7 or 8 in a row. And after each one, it's like swoosh. Yes, you have to take me. Swoosh. How can you not take me? I'm so good. Swoosh.
Just talking trash to Dave Griffin at every basket great. That he hits.
And they love it. Like it was in a like, I'll say tasteful. That's not the proper word, but they loved it. They ate it all up. They thought it was great. They had dinner with him. They loved him. They wanted him number one. They said it was the greatest workout they've ever seen. And then the next morning he wakes up and his foot is killing him, and it's discovered that he has a fracture in his foot that he suffered a few weeks earlier during a workout, and it was never diagnosed. The Cavaliers decide they need a win now, so whatever that means. So they take Wiggins. I guess it kind of worked out for them because they flipped Wiggins for Kevin Love, and then LeBron came back. That's an interesting what if. But then, so Embiid comes back, and pretty early on, Embiid realizes how powerful a superstar in the NBA can be. And he's not wrong, right, in power to him, but we've seen it last week. Being in peak condition has never been a priority of his. And we saw last year down the stretch of the season, like that anecdote you mentioned, that was in Miami before, like, I think it was the second, third, one of the final regular season games of the year. And Embiid, if you remember, he was having those knee issues, and was he dealing with the stomach bug already then? That might have been later. But just, he was laboring down the stretch, and it was very obvious. And there's a meeting, and Brett goes in with the medical staff and the training staff. Pretty much says, if Joel's not getting in shape, we're all going to get fired, with some more colorful language, because that's one of the things I learned about Brett.
All right, so having gone through your own process of researching the process and talking to those people, if you now had to build your own basketball team, would you ever recommend to someone to go through this process?
Yeah, so the answer is this is, Hinkie gets labeled as tanking guy, but this was the best path, right? He knew this was the best way. He knew, and this was the math he did. If you look at NBA champions, they have superstars. What's the best way to get a superstar? It's through the draft. It's changed a little bit now. They flattened the odds a little bit in response to the Sixers process, so they've made it, they've hurt them. The math is not as friendly in terms of if you finish with one of the worst records, you're less likely to get a top pick. Also, I think one of the interesting changes is that, and this was sort of set off by LeBron, superstars become available now. They move teams. They used to not really change teams. Now these guys change teams pretty frequently, and contracts are shorter, and teams are on the clock always. And just saw whether Paul George ends up and re-signs with Oklahoma City, which is like a sign of hope for all small markets, and then 1 year later asks for a trade, which is a sign of hope for that. Even if guys are under contract, they're still available, right? So It just shows you there are other ways to get stars. So I don't know if the math is quite in favor of going on a 3-4 year tear down like this. 1 or 2 for sure. It'd be interesting to see, at a certain point, it wouldn't be worth it, I think.
The book is Tanking to the Top, the Philadelphia 76ers and the most audacious process in the history of professional sports. Yaron, thanks so much for the time. We wish you the best of luck with the book and encourage everybody to go out and get it.
Thank you for having me on, guys. I truly appreciate it.
Have a great one.